Yes, but try again.
We can hear you now.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Hazard Mitigation and Resilience Planning Town Hall meeting for St. Thomas. I am Dr. Kim Waddell, with the University of the Virgin Islands. I'm here with my colleague, Dr. Greg Waddell, Janae Francis Brown, Nikita Lawyer. Okay. Yeah, bear with me. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
All right, I'll try and speak loudly and clearly. All right. So again, welcome. We are here to present the current hazard mitigation and resilience plan for the territory of the U.S. Virgin Islands. This was done in conjunction with our colleagues from HMRP, as well as the funding support from FEMA. So the title of our presentation is Building Resilience here in the U.S. Virgin Islands, preparing for tomorrow today. So what is a hazard mitigation plan? This is a FEMA mandated plan that requires an effort that's updated every 5 years. It is required for if the territory wants to get into pre or post mitigation funding, now called RIC, from FEMA for the territory. And also, once the recommendations are in the plan, it allows for the territory to use the plan recommendations to get additional funding from other federal agencies. And also, town halls like this is part of our public engagement, which allows us to build community support and awareness for resilience, recovery, and risk reduction initiatives that are identified in the plan. So one of the things that made this makes this particular plan or all plans quite important is the fact that we've seen from various storms and events of the past that the VI economy is highly vulnerable to shocks and disruptions from natural disasters. And so one of the things we've graphed here is basically showing the impact on employment over time. And so we have 3 events here: Hurricane Hugo, Hurricane Marilyn, Irma and Maria, and then Irma and Maria in Puerto Rico. And so what you see here is after the event happens, we have a large dip in employment. And this makes sense when you think about how the storm disrupted our tourism and all of our local businesses, whether it's due to lack of power or what have you. All of these events caused a major drop in employment or a rise in unemployment. And so what we see though is that it sets us back not just for a couple of days or a couple of weeks, but often years. And the fact is, when we look at the various storms, we see that Irma, which is in the red here, I know it's hard to tell, but this had one of the longest impacts on our economy, at least from the employment standpoint. And so this is really indicative of how slow and challenging our recovery was to build back our economy, to build back employment. Now, the other thing, and we'll speak more to this as we get a little further along, hurricanes like Irma and Maria really impact our population numbers. And so many of you may not know that between 2010 and 2020, the 2 periods of the census in the United States and in the Virgin Islands, we had an 18+% drop here in the USVI over that 10-year period. Now, a lot of it was due to the hurricane. A lot of it was also right up to COVID, and probably we've seen some effects of COVID since 2020. So what's different about this plan? Now, historically, currently we have a 2019 plan that's in effect, and so this one is approved. But the 2019 plan basically is a hazard mitigation plan. So what makes this plan different is the additional word resilience, which also means resilience planning. So when we think about traditional plans, we have the three major objectives. We want to understand hazards and risks. We also want to identify them, characterize them, and I'll explain more of that in a little bit, but we'll also have opportunity to develop strategies to reduce that risk. So when we do that together, then ultimately we're able to mitigate and manage risk. And that's ultimately what the plan is designed to do, is to help us find ways to mitigate and manage risks that are in the future. Ultimately, this addresses the impacts of these hazards that cause stress to our society, our communities here in the Virgin Islands. When we think about resilience planning, we add two new dimensions to that. So in addition to those first three, understanding hazards, risks, developing strategies, and mitigating them or managing them, we also want to look at how to address the underlying conditions of the systems that we rely on here in the territory. And from that, that'll allow us to try and build resilience. And we'll speak more to that in a little bit. But the idea is to understand what makes our society function and operate normally. And what do we have to understand about that in order to build resilience, as well as plan for how do we mitigate and manage risk moving forward. The idea is that we want to address the impact of hazards that cause stress to our society, our communities, as well as improve the operations and governance, how we manage our different systems and agencies moving forward, ultimately to try and reduce recovery time and the expenditure, not how much money we have to spend to rebuild and restore our communities moving forward.
So, turn it off and on again. Turn it off and on again.
Where's the on and off? No, I didn't.
I'll do the next slide.
All right. Bear with me, a little technical difficulty. So here's another way of thinking of what I was just describing. So imagine that state one, this is where we were, say, in August of 2017. Business as usual, it's a hot summer. Our government is working, our businesses are working, we have some tourism, everything is pretty much normal. Then a natural disaster hits. And so what you're going to see, or what we have experienced, is that we will have a real impact on the cost of this storm, the impact, as well as the time. And so the ability to recover is really driven by how resilient the system is. And so resilience addresses the hazard risk and the underlying condition. What is the state of our schools, our transportation, our businesses, our healthcare system? All of those systems work together to provide services. If the longer that they are disrupted, the longer time and the more money it takes for us to recover. And so what you're seeing here is that over time, a less resilient system takes more money and more time to recover. A more resilient system does it quicker and less expensively. If, for example, what we saw with COVID was that it really delayed that whole recovery process. It slowed us down. And so what you might end up having is a second state. We never really get back to where we were, let's say, in 2017 or earlier. We could, but it's really hard when you have multiple stresses, multiple things slowing down the cost and the impact of our recovery. And so one of the key things we've learned from watching the recovery is that our operations, if they are efficient, lead to more resilient systems and a faster recovery. But as we all experience, it has been much slower and much more difficult here in the territory. Next slide. So our plan is really shaped around 5 major principles. And so I've spoken a little bit about resilience, and again, as you throughout the presentation tonight, you'll hear more about that. But the idea of understanding how our systems work, how they work together. But the next variable is sustainability. Whatever recommendations or practices that we might put in place to mitigate future risk has to be sustainable. We have to figure out how to afford it, how to sustain it, whether it's with more people doing the same job, or what have you. But the idea is, can we do that? Can we afford to do that? One of the unique things about this plan that's basically starting to happen to many other hazard mitigation resilience plans moving forward is the fact that we've adopted climate adaptation, because climate change is a major disruption and exacerbates, like the storm we saw in 2017. Climate adaptation is part of our planning effort. We also have to look at how unique our communities are, both in demographics and both racially, culturally, and otherwise. It's fairly unique, but you have to think about what those differences and that diversity, what that means to the mitigation process, to our recovery process. And then finally, our capacity. What's our capacity to rebuild, to recover, to make the kind of changes and recommendations necessary to complete the recovery and restore all of the services that we're used to. Next slide. So this is a rather busy slide, but the fact is, typical or conventional hazard mitigation plans really, and this is where FEMA is very good at and focuses a lot of their energy on, is on restoring and rebuilding the critical infrastructure. And so when we're talking about governance and our government's ability to do different things in the different agencies, but our energy sector, WAPA, our transportation sector, the roads, public works, et cetera, our telecommunications ability, and then of course, our natural resource. So that's, again, traditional hazard mitigation planning. However, when you think about who makes all of this work, it's people like yourselves, the communities, how you're employed, with the work that you do, and you are definitely in these different sectors or services. You're in the
Red button.
Sorry?
You can use the red button.
Okay. So, for example, we have the economy, housing, the education sector. These are the services that all of us rely on in order to work and function in this side. So you have to really look at both sectors. And the fact is, when we look at the natural hazards that are common to the territory, we have earthquakes, tsunamis, landslides. We have stronger intense storms like we saw in 2017. As we've also experienced over the last 5+ years, we've had extended droughts. Now, this past few weeks doesn't seem like it, but the fact is we often get these intense rainstorms, and then we go months without any rain. And so we have these flash floods and heavy rainfall, and then we transition to undetermined lengths of drought like we've had over the past 5 years. And then obviously climate change also impacts sea level rise and the higher temperatures like we experienced this past fall, when a lot of the schools, students were really suffering because the buildings didn't have air conditioning and it was just plain hot. And unfortunately, we're expecting the same thing this upcoming year. So by looking at both sides, the essential services and the critical infrastructure, through the lens of these natural hazards that we are exposed to, the idea is that we can generate a hazard mitigation resilient plan that addresses both sides of the equation, so to speak, and leads us to a more resilient Virgin Islands. So this plan development planning process is quite intense. There's a lot of components to it, but you can see on the right side, we have the processes, the assessments, the analyses. We took all the hazards, and you'll hear more about them in a moment, that we provided profiles, we did a risk assessment, and then obviously a sustainability analysis, and that with the support of a steering committee, interviews, both with citizens as well as government agencies and representatives from the different business sectors or university or education sectors. We collected a fair bit of information that guides our development of strategies and a planning framework, and then a series of recommendations, which we'll hear about towards the end of our presentation, that all compose, make up the hazard mitigation and resilience plan. We could not have done this without a lot of outside help. I mean, we maximized our resources here in the territory, but the fact is we had a lot of partners, both within the government but also from other universities, FEMA, and local consulting groups as well. But overall, the resilience has guided our activities, our research, and it helped us develop an understanding. And it's, again, the resilience focus on systems and how it works together is really what we use to develop this planning process. So, and again, we'll keep revisiting some of these points, but the plan goals had three major things to focus on, sort of guideposts. One is obviously we want to manage risk. I mean, that's what the hazard mitigation plan has to do, is help the territory manage risk. I've been talking about systems. You'll hear about how these different systems or agencies or communities have to work together and sync up, work together in order for us to think more holistically, more comprehensively about how they might work. And then the final piece is practice governance. This is how do we do this work? How do we implement these changes? Who is responsible for those decisions? And how do we support them or they support us? But that governance, whether it's at a small agency, who's the boss, who's doing their job, or at the level of the governor or the legislature, these are all elements that are involved in practicing governance. And so, in order for us to have a resilient Virgin Islands, we need an adaptive management of risk, because risks change, just like the weather does, just like our populations change. These are all, we have to adapt and manage it as those changes come about. And they're exacerbated by the fact that climate change is also driving change around us. A systems approach and good governance are what we absolutely need in order to implement and meet the necessary steps to have a resilient Virgin Islands. So I'm now going to turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Greg Waddell, who's going to actually dig deeper into those big goals that I just mentioned. The first one is managing risk.
Thank you. Afternoon, everyone. So I'm just going to walk you through those three main goals and the result of those three main goals now. The first one is managing risk. It's a hazard mitigation and resilience plan. So we need to know what type of hazards we have and our exposures to those hazards. The plan is online. There will be a link at the end. It's 400 to 500 pages long, so we cannot describe everything. We cannot go to all the details. So I will just present you some highlights, and you can find more information either by reading the executive summary of the report, which is at the very beginning, or picking which chapter you want to read in more detail to have more information. The other thing is we looked at each hazard and try to understand the impact on the different infrastructure service sectors in the territory. So what is the impact of wind on power, water, health services, government, economy, etc., etc. Again, I cannot go through all of that tonight, so I will just provide some snippets, some just ideas of what those impacts can look like. But please go to the report itself if you want to have more information. If you want to know, for example, what does a tsunami mean for healthcare services or housing in the territory. Okay, so now I'm going to go through the slides. So the first hazard is hurricane winds. As Kim mentioned, the hurricane season is upon us. It's supposed to be a very active season. Luckily, we will not be, hopefully we will not be hit, but nevertheless, the fact is the higher you live, the more exposure you have, because the wind sort of speeds up as it goes along the hills and up the mountain. So if, for example, one person experiences a category 4 along the coastline, as you go up the hill, Crown Mountain, etc., you're going to experience a category 5 hurricane. So it's very important to understand that the higher you live, the more risk, the more exposure you have. And so in this case, we have more than $15 billion of assets that are at risk when it comes to hurricane wind speeds. And more than 50% of the home on St. Thomas and St. John would experience category 5 hurricane, when other residences that are lower will only represent experience a category 4 wind speed. So this is the wind hazard. Another one that often comes when it's a hurricane is rainfall. When it rains, it pours. But what we found through our analysis is that actually most of the big rain events, the big flooding events don't happen during hurricanes. They happen like, we had 2 weeks ago. And they happen when actually they saw last night, there's an advisory that the last 2 weeks of May, we will have exceptional rainfall, right? And it's not hurricane season. So when we think about rainfall and flooding, we need to think about almost the opposite of what we saw for the wind. The lower you live, the more flooding you're going to experience because you are in a flood zone. That's where water is going to pool. So on St. Thomas, it's hard to see, but pretty much all of town is the flood zone. Some Tutu, some in Nada, some in Megan's Bay, but pretty much all of town is in a flood zone. And I will get to that in a minute. We also did the same, and we found that a lot of St. Croix also is in a flood zone. FEMA is using some of our results to update their maps. But the fact is, a lot of government buildings, especially the legislature on St. Thomas, the judicial building on St. Thomas, the government building on St. Croix, all of those assets are in the flood zone. So we are thinking not only about impact to people, but impact to the government and its ability to function after a major rainfall event. And as we saw, those events, those big rainfall events tend to have cascading effects, meaning that as we experienced, we didn't have power for almost 2 days, right? Because of the consequence of what happens during big rainstorm. Some people didn't have water as well because water and power are combined. Transportation is also impacted, right? So we need to think about our building, but we also need to think about the other infrastructure systems that are dependent on one another. And one wind fails, the other sort of cascade through, and we just sit home in the dark, and it's a very uncomfortable situation. Another hazard that I think we experienced also in the last few weeks is earthquakes, right? We sort of felt these tremors, and the fact is those are, no damage, maybe a tile popped here, maybe a pipe broke over there. But the fact is, here in the territory, our risk is actually much higher than Puerto Rico, or not much higher. It's similar to the highest risk in Puerto Rico. I don't know if you remember a few years ago, there was a big earthquake in Puerto Rico. Some building collapses, some building collapsed, the school collapsed because they were not built up to hazard, to the earthquake sort of hazard. Well, something similar can happen in the Virgin Islands, especially on St. Thomas and St. John, where the darker color here in red or orange mean higher risk. The other thing, so in those regions, the sort of Boboni, Nada sort of region up in the mount, like the north side, those regions would experience the highest amount of shaking. Overall, St. Thomas and John are more at risk than St. Croix. That's because we are closer to a lot of the faults that are by the BVI, Puerto Rico, so we are more exposed. And the thing about living in the Virgin Islands is that we live on hills. Like I mentioned, living on a hill increases your risk when it comes to wind, but it also increases your risk when it comes to earthquake. What happens is when you have an earthquake wave going uphill, it also amplifies. So the shaking is higher when you are on a hill, and if you have a house on stilts, those 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 stilts, they're going to start wobbling, and your house is then going to collapse. So one thing that we identify in the document is the need for closing all those houses on stilts. There are some guidelines on how to do that, so that our risk in the territory would not be as high. Currently, more than 60% of homes on St. Thomas and St. John are in the highest shaking region. So it's just a matter of time before the big one, and the big one can be catastrophic. The other thing that we found is these areas in gray here that you see in the map. Those are filled. We went and built in the water to build the airport, to build the waterfront. The airport was built in the 70s, so close to 50 years ago. At the time, it's unlikely that it took earthquake risk into account. because they didn't know what we know now about our earthquake risk. What happens is if you go to the beach, for example, and you start jumping on the sand, you see the sand sort of becoming a little bit looser, and you sort of sink in the sand a little bit, right? This phenomenon is called liquefaction. And this is what can happen is there can be a liquefaction of the soil on the waterfront, the airport of St. Thomas, Lime Tree, Provenza, which is also a terminal for cargo and oil. Christiansted, Christiansted, Wapa on St. Croix, Wapa on St. Thomas, all of those are on field. So a major earthquake can cause significant damage to our power infrastructure, our transportation infrastructure, etc., etc. Basically, a major earthquake can cripple us. And what we found is that we haven't really taken that risk seriously in the territory. There are a lot of mitigation effort to address the earthquake risk. And so we encourage you as homeowners, but also the government and government facilities to start putting in place a plan to address the earthquake risk in a territory. When there's an earthquake, there's a tsunami. A tsunami is caused by an earthquake. Maybe this earthquake is going to be far away, but maybe the earthquake is going to be close by. And if you have an earthquake, you're going to have a tsunami. The tsunami is mostly going to impact the coastal environment, but again, it's the same region. On St. Thomas, it could be the airport, the waterfront, Wapa. On St. Croix, Wapa, some of the government building in town, the Frederickstead and its waterfront, and a lot of the Lime Tree, Provenza area, which again is a major transportation hub for the territory. So not only the earthquake can cause a lot of damage, the tsunami can come and finish whatever damage that was caused before. And again, we need to sort of start thinking about what does it mean if we get hit by a tsunami, what does it mean for continuation of services, for our ability to receive goods, for our ability to produce water, to produce power, or to even move around. All our major roads are coastal roads, right? So those stories, the other thing about tsunami is that if a tsunami hits one part of the island, it sort of wraps around the island. So all parts of the island are impacted. So it's one of those rare hazards that would impact everything at once. Again, we see that a tsunami would impact the legislature, the Supreme Court, the Senate. A lot of the major branches of the government would basically come to a standstill, right? We looked at landslide and wildfire. Those are less talked about because our risk is not as dramatic as what we can see in other places where major landslides can destroy thousands of homes. In a territory, landslides destroy maybe a few or, 1, 2, 3. It's not to say that it is not dangerous or we should neglect the fact that those homes have been impacted, but compared to other hazards, this risk is not as great. Nevertheless, the higher you live, if you live on a slope, if you live next to a slope, your chance of being impacted by a landslide and have your house being destroyed or negatively impacted is higher. And that is mostly the case for St. Thomas and St. John. The wildfire risk is also not as dramatic as what you would see in the mainland. We don't have the big forest that would create the type of wildfire. We actually had maybe 2 wildfires on record, and those were contained relatively quickly because they were bushfire. Nonetheless, with the dry conditions that we are experiencing with a lot of bush, which is basically fuel just sitting there, the chances for wildfire and negative consequences is real. Just look at what happened in Hawaii, right? It's not because it didn't happen that we should neglect it. And what we find is that in this case, St. Croix is one of the most vulnerable because it's so dry, so big, so much bush, especially on the east side of St. Croix. So we took this hazard into account and we provide some recommendation on how to start mitigating, potential impact. And again, if you are interested in learning more about those hazards, please go to the plan online. Beyond man-made hazard, we also looked, beyond natural hazard, we also looked at man-made hazard. So we looked at what happened if, for example, there's a road accident. So we all know we've all experienced those trucks that drive very fast. You know, sometimes they are full of water, sometimes they are full of gasoline, sometimes it's a trash truck that drive very fast. What happens if there's an accident? Or two cars going at high speed, what happens if there's an accident? So we identified some hotspots as well as some potential schools that can be impacted because they are close to the road, some government buildings, some homes that can be impacted. So we sort of, did this accounting to again highlight the risk from a road accident, from a major road accident, and try to encourage having more restriction on speed limits or type of vehicles going in particular type of regions. We did the same for hazardous material. What we found is that actually we don't have a good understanding of hazardous material in territory. We don't quite know where they are, which is not a very good thing. We need to know where different type of chemicals are being stocked so we can actually understand what to do if there's an accident. So that's a data gap that we highlighted as a major data gap in a territory. Nevertheless, what we've done is we identify location of major oil facilities, major gas station, and sort of went through the exercise who would be impacted if there is a spill of some sort. And then the last thing we looked at, oh, yes, the other thing about the hazardous material that we all are familiar with, if we don't manage them properly, is the Bovoni fires, right? We had two fires actually last year. One that was not as dramatic, but happened first was a bunch of electronics and cars that just started to burn. And that was very difficult to contain because it was a lot of chemicals that started to burn, right? And then the next one was because of a stockpiling of the debris from the hurricane. So this type of hazardous material are very dangerous, and they can, in the case of the cars and the electronics that were not properly stored, they can create fire, right? They can create fire that can impact our health, close, cause school closures, etc., right? So better understanding how to manage our waste, better understanding where the different type of hazardous material are is critical for us to live, in a healthy and safe manner. The last man-made hazard that we looked at were airport and seaports. So what we found is that the probability of an accident from a maritime point of view is highest on St. Thomas because that's where we have the highest amount of boat traffic in a territory. But what we also found is that all of town for St. Thomas is actually at risk of either a maritime or airplane traffic. We have seaplane, airplane, both of them flying over town, which is heavily densely populated. And we also have a variety of boats, recreational, commercial, and private that are also moving. So we highlighted the fact that this region around town is actually very vulnerable for maritime and air transportation accident, as well as this corridor on St. Paul. If there are any pressing questions, don't hesitate to raise your hand. It's hot. Yeah, it's hot. And because it's hot, we recognize the need to identify and try to characterize that new hazard that we are now living with, heat. The last year was the hottest ever on St. Croix. The number of days above 95 degrees was 20, but we all know that different regions experience different level of heat, especially if we live in an urban area, Tutu, town, etc. It's very hot because not only heat is becoming a problem, but the heavy level of urbanization, the lack of tree shade in some region really increases the ambient heat. It's hot during the day and it's hot during the night. And that is a problem because if you cannot cool off during the night, you don't get the rest that you need and you start to have a lot of physiological issues, especially if you are a vulnerable, part of a vulnerable type community with, either, existing health condition or age, et cetera, et cetera. So heat is one of the new type of hazard that we characterize and provide recommendations for. I think it's going to be a very difficult hazard to mitigate against, because how do you deal with heat in a building like this one, where we have mostly fans, some windows, a lot of areas for any type of cooling to escape or for heat to come in, because we were not built. We never experienced that hazard before, so we didn't build for it, right? So putting AC in a location, if you want to do it in a way that does not really hurt you financially, requires a lot of structural changes. So the heat hazard is, we can recognize it, we know some of the solutions, but implementing some of those solutions is not that easy. So we provide some recommendations for us to start thinking about and start preparing for a hot future. This summer is going to be very hot. The fact that it is hot now means it's just going to get hotter. Next year might be cool, but please, if next year is cool, remember, you don't know what the next year is going to come, because if anything, it's just going to get hotter and hotter and hotter. That's the future. Another thing that we found is that it's drier. Yes, we are having big rain, record-breaking rainfall, and we're going to have potentially record-breaking rainfall in the next 2 weeks. But last year was dry, the year before was dry, the year before was dry. Actually, if we look at the statistics since 2019, we've been in a state of drought more than literally 80% of the time. On St. Croix, it's almost 90% of the time in the last 5 years that it's been in a state of drought. So managing water is something that I know a lot of people are thinking about it, but I think that's something that as a community, as a territory, we have to think about in a more comprehensive manner. And sargassum is the last hazard that we identify. That is not a natural hazard per se, but a stressor, something that is really impairing the quality of life in terms of ability to go outside, ability to go to the beach, impairing and negatively impacting some of the infrastructure system. Look at what happened in St. Croix 2 years ago, and also impacting our health. Schools have to be closed in some regions because of the noxious gases that are emitted by the decomposing sargassum. So it's a hazard that we have to deal with, and some of it is caused by climate change. Some of it is caused by human, but some of it is caused by climate change. So in a nutshell, those three emerging threats, in addition to the man-made hazard, are also new compared to the previous hazard mitigation plan effort. So now that we've talked about hazards, what we realize, as Kim mentioned, is that it's one thing to identify and say hazard, 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 impact, impact, impact. It's a different thing to start thinking about, okay, what are the consequences of those hazards on different systems? How one hazard in one location can impact the functioning or your ability to receive a service. Why raining 2 weeks ago impacted us in our ability to, get power? Because it's a system. We have different type of infrastructure systems that are made of different components that depend on each other, but that are also dependent on other type of systems. And so that's one thing that we identify in this plan, is that we need to go beyond just saying, let's fix a room. We need to go beyond saying, let's get a new turbine. We have to look at the entire system, the entire infrastructure system, and start thinking about how can we make sure that you receive the service that you need in order to function. So it's a change in perspective that requires a different level of analysis, and I will show you some of the analysis that we have done to sort of start thinking in terms of systems. If you want more information, please look at the plan online. So water, right? What we found is that we actually have different ways of getting water in the territory. Some people have cisterns, WAPA desalinates water, some people have wells. And some people here in the user side, the people who receive that service, we use one source, two sources, three sources of water. Some people have a cistern when they purchase water in a store. This water usually, if it's the 1 gallon bottle, goes from wells. Some people have WAPA, some people have a cistern at the same time and purchase water. Some people have wells and cistern, etc., etc. But what we found is that despite this well of getting water, there's actually nobody managing water in a territory. If you have a problem with your cistern, you are on your own. If you have a problem with your well, you are on your own. If you have a problem, if WAPA stops providing water, if you have a cistern, good for you, otherwise you're on your own. But there are public cisterns full of water, right, that can come in. WAPA could come in also and help, other part of the system. So what we are saying is that the VI is a complex system of systems, like I said, but the services received from those systems are critical for our health and survival, and we need to start thinking comprehensively. We need to start looking at water instead of looking at WAPA. We need to look at power instead of looking at WAPA, and that requires rethinking who provides the service, rethinking how the service is provided, and who manages that service. Another system we looked at, among others, and in this case we're talking about infrastructure systems, is the healthcare system. So we all recognize that the hospital needs to be fixed. The fact that the roof blew off during the hurricane is a no-no. So fixing the hospital, making sure that the roof is solid, making sure the walls are solid is one thing. Making sure that the generator is working or that there's solar power and battery, that's good. That's it's important. But we also need to think about who provides the service, right? A hospital without doctor is useless, right? A hospital without nurses is useless, right? Even going to the doctor but not being able to go to the pharmacy, it's useless for some people, right? Including me. So we sort of started to look at, some statistics about the fact that, we have one physician for 1,000 person in territory, one of the lowest ratio in the Caribbean. We found that there's an acute lack of mental health care providers, especially for children, right? We also found, for example, that 74% of children are covered by Medicaid compared to an average of 37%. Meaning access to healthcare is a problem for many children. Dental healthcare is a problem for many children and adults in the territory, right? So we highlight those because what we are saying is that we need to fix the hard infrastructure. We need to fix access to the critical services that allow the infrastructure to function. But we also need to think about and address some of the issues related to who provides the service. In this case, the healthcare system. We did the same thing for the education system and other type of services. The point is that we are dealing with a system. So it's the built environment, it's the people, and it's an interdependency between this system and others. And it's very important that we do that because ultimately, like I mentioned, when we are thinking about infrastructure, when we're thinking about hazard and hazard mitigation, what we are thinking about is if something bad happens, the hazard, how can we continue to function? Meaning, how can we continue to receive services? WAPA on an island with nobody is useless, right? The point of WAPA is to provide power or water. So the question is, how can you receive power or water if something goes wrong? And so if we ask this question, we take some of the approach and we have the analysis that I showed you in the previous slides. But if we ask this question, we need to also ask, who are we as Virgin Islanders? And so what we find is that the Virgin Island has changed. Here in black is the Virgin Island in 2010, in 2000, a high number of youth, a lower number of people over 65. And what we found is that between 2000, 2010 in green, and 2020 in red, the number of youth has decreased. The number of people that are considered working class, working age has also decreased. But the number of people who are over 65, who are usually considered to be retired or about to be retired, has increased. This class of people over 65 is also the one that is usually considered as the one that receives the most amount of social services, right? And so what we see is that the number of people who receive over 65 has steadily increased. It increased between 2020 and 2010, between 2010 and 2020, while the amount of youth and the amount of people in the working sort of age group has decreased, especially in between 2010 and 2020. So what does it mean? It means that the tax base has probably decreased because fewer people are working, and we have seen that in some of the report in the government. The number of people in the territory has decreased, the number of tax receipts has decreased, the amount of money that the government receives has decreased. But we still have to care for a population that is almost the majority population or a large portion of the population. So that's an imbalance that is critical to sort of think about how to address when we are thinking about water system, power system, telecommunication system, et cetera, et cetera. We also need to think about our environment, in the built environment. This graph here, and I will show you some more detail in the next slide, shows how between 1985 to 2020, right before the new census, the population of the VI fluctuated, but towards the end decreased, and it's decreasing again. And I showed you that in the previous slide. Even though the population has decreased, the amount of green area, non-built area, has also decreased, while the amount of structure, the amount of built area has increased. In map, this is what that looks like. This is St. Croix in 85, where green and green type colors represent non-developed, maybe a house, but a big yard, lot of bush. Everything in red, orange is developed. Buildings, roads, streets, etc. What we found is that on St. Croix, between 85 to 2018, there was a large increase. Christiansted, Frederiksted, Wim area, around Lime Tree, all of these areas have experienced a large increase in development. St. Thomas, Tutu, Nada, pretty much all of St. Thomas except maybe the north side and then part of Frenchman Street area have all experienced dramatic increase in development. St. John, everywhere pretty much except the national park, has experienced dramatic increase in development. Again, this has happened in the background of declining population. And the consequence of some of this is that you're going to experience higher heat, because if you develop, what happens is that the road, the concrete pad in front of your house, even your house, is going to absorb all that heat during the day and release it during the night. So that's why I was saying earlier that some of the heat is a local regional phenomenon, but it's also driven by some of our choices in how we develop. If you go to Tutu, who likes to walk from, say, Walgreens to Kmart? Anybody has done it? Anybody has done it walking? I haven't. I don't want to. It's terrible, right? But the one of the reasons is because of the way that we are developed. All that heat is emitted, right? And so it becomes uncomfortable. The consequence of that development, the consequence of increasing footprint of construction is that we need more roads. However, declining population, declining tax base means we don't have the same amount of money to maintain the roads. So what we did, for example, What we did in this exercise was to rate all the roads in the territory, the major roads in the territory, and we asked, going through all those potholes, swerving to avoid all those potholes, what is the cost of bad road condition in terms of changing tires, changing suspension, et cetera, et cetera? What we found is that St. Croix is basically, paying $12 million as a community in general, aggregate numbers, because of bad road condition. St. Thomas, close to 5 million. St. John, $250,000, but that's because most of the roads are maintained by the national park. So what does it mean really? It means that this close to, let's say, $16, $18 million are not staying in the territory. We pay the mechanic, but where do the parts come from? They come from the mainland, right? So we import stuff, pay for it. So this money is going away and not staying here. So the condition of the roads leads to money that we have to spend, that we could have spent on something else, but it's also not growing the economy. So it's almost a negative feedback loop for us and for the territory. The consequence of this development has also increased our flooding risk. So this map here shows a rainfall event. So it rains very hard, and then it sort of stops raining. And after every rain event, you have flooding. So the blue line represents the type of flooding that we would have in 1985. The red line represents the flooding that we have in 2018 based on the type of land cover, where the buildings are, where the roads are, where the trees and the forests are. The thing is, when it rains, water just flows on the road, flows on everything that is paved all the way to the sea. Whereas if it's not paved, some of it still flows, but some of it also gets into the ground. So having more development can be considered as good by some, but what it does if it's not managed well is it increasing stormwater. So in this case, we had 40% increase of runoff or stormwater to deal with on St. Thomas for the Queen's Quarter gut, for example. For the Bethlehem gut on St. Croix, we're talking about almost 3 times more water to deal with, right? Because of the fact that we have developed in a way that does not let water to be absorbed. And like I mentioned earlier, this table here shows that most of this flooding does not really happen during hurricane season. So the maintenance of the drainage infrastructure should happen year-round. It should not just happen in June. So again, why is it important to think about that? Well, what we believe is that it's important to think about this and address some of those issues, because the consequence is that if you don't receive the services that you need to have a comfortable life, you're going to look elsewhere. You're going to leave. And that's what we experienced, between 2017 and 2020. Maybe there was some error in the census, but I do believe that a lot of people left the territory, right? And so what we did is we sort of looked at, where do the people who have left the territory come from? And that's the arrow in red here. And where people who came in the territory, where did they go? That's the arrows in green. And then we also asked the question, where are the most socially, economically vulnerable? People who don't make a lot of money, and or people who live in crowded homes, people who live in homes of lesser quality, less structurally stable quality, people with no cars, etc., etc. So we sort of, and those are regions in red. Regions in lighter colors are people who make a little bit more money, people who have more comfortable living situation, people who are more socioeconomically stable, let's say. And what we found is that, especially on St. Thomas, most of the people who have left come from those regions that are the most socially vulnerable. and it's the same onset point. Yes, there are some gates here and there, but overall, when we sort of superimpose the two data sets, we see that it's the most socially vulnerable who have left the territory. We don't know why, because it's hard to ask, and I didn't ask them, I didn't ask them, but we can have some pointers. One thing that we found is that those regions that are the most socially vulnerable, which is represented in the dark red in this figure, are also those that are exposed the most to flooding. They are also the ones that are the most exposed to road being underwater. So they have problems with potentially in their home. They also have problems accessing the road network, etc. We also are finding that those who have an additional source of power, being a generator or solar power, what we are finding is that those tend to be wealthiest, to have more money than those who don't. So there is a very strong socio-economic reality that we need to sort of acknowledge in our ability to withstand, to be resilient to the storm. And that goes back to the ability to receive service. If you cannot receive the service, your quality of life will be compromised and you will leave. And so that's what we try to sort of convey this hazard mitigation and resilience plan, is the need to not only fix the hard infrastructure, but to fix what's beneath the functioning of the territory. Because otherwise, this is the reality. We're also going back to the point about the land use. We also are making the point that it's important to think about how we're going to develop in the future. So this map represents a scenario of, what a future would look like if we try to limit development. And what we found in this graph, and I will not go into detail, but the bottom of this, the takeaway from this graph is that if we continue to develop, this is development now, if we continue on this trajectory and have more development, we're going to have almost an extra $500 billion in potential losses in the future. But if we try to contain the development, or even think about how to develop in a slightly different way, we can actually minimize the number of the amount of additional loss, or even potentially decrease the amount of potential losses, because we would have built in better location. We would also have concentrated some assets in some location and protecting them, versus trying to protect everything in a disparate manner. So the point here is that we need to think about the services, we need to think about who receives the service, and we need to think about how we develop our the islands altogether. And this will have negative consequences if we don't manage it well, but it can be positive if we manage it properly. So this is the last slide on this topic, and it's a bit of a cartoonish way of summarizing what we were saying, which is that all of us, ultimately, we want to have physical, mental, and social and economic well-being, right? We want to be able to have a good time with our friend and live long. But to do that, we depend on all those systems. We depend on all those infrastructure systems. We need water, power, we need to be able to go to the bank, we need to be able to go to the beach, etc., etc. If we don't manage those systems well, meaning we build so that they are protected, but we also think about making sure doctors are at the hospital, or teachers are in school, or school provide education services. If you don't manage them, when we have a shock, an earthquake, a tsunami, even COVID, things can just go completely haywire, and the consequences are people will leave. So it's important for us to manage things, the people, the built environment, and the ecosystem. It's important to focus on the three of them when we're thinking about hazard mitigation. Okay? All right. The last goal is governance. How are we going to manage all those systems? Now that we recognize that there is a group of people, a group of buildings, a group of infrastructure sectors that are required for us to thrive, it's important then to ask the question, how are we going to manage them? How are we going to make sure that there's a proper governance system, that there are policies, practices, procedures that allow exchange of information, that allow exchange of resources, that allow constant communication so that, oh, there's something wrong here, let me tell you about it so that you can prepare and adapt when things will go wrong. So that's governance. And what we find after talking to a lot of folks and looking at the systems in the territory is that there are some serious challenges in the territory when it comes to governance. The water system has no governance. We have a wealth of water sources, but nobody is really in charge of making sure everybody has water, right? So that's a governance issue. What we find looking at different systems is that overall the territory and the agency underestimates the severity of hazard. So they are not really, it's hard to then think about how can we make sure we provide service if there's an earthquake. Or the airport is down, because we found that the airport is actually at high risk of failing if we have a serious earthquake. We find that information and resources go through a specific network. I know you, you're my friend, I will tell you something. I don't know you, you're not really my friend, I will not tell you something. And that ultimately goes against our ability to rebound, because that person who didn't say something is not then able to say something to somebody else, and then can have negative consequences that you might not know of that will impact you in a negative way. Because again, it's a whole connected system, and sometimes we don't know all the parts of it. We find that agencies have limited business continuity planning, low morale, limited project management capabilities and capacity. The low morale is important. If you're not very invested, if you don't really feel that you belong, you're not going to go the extra mile. You're not going to stay the extra hour to make sure that this or that works, right? And we cannot really blame people with low morale who don't want to do the extra work. But what we can do is try to address this so that when things go wrong, we can expand our capacity and our capabilities, and we can count on each other. The infrastructure is getting more robust. There's a lot of work that the territory is doing to fix things. But what we find is that we are in constant crisis mode. The WAPA example from a few weeks ago is a good reminder of that. A rainfall, a strike, the whole system goes down, and we are down in stress for 2 days, and really it takes us 3-4 days to recover from that. It took me a few days to recover from it. It's not like, oh yeah, WAPA is back and everything goes back to normal. No, there are some long-term impacts. Lack of process and standard procedure, that's some of the core function of having good governance. Limited coordination and integration. And like I said, not having a functioning, smoothly running operation ultimately impacts the economy. One day I went to CHS, I wanted to buy something, nothing important, I forgot what it was, but I couldn't make my purchase. Why? Because WAPA was down, and somehow VIA was down, and so the credit card machine was not working. Well, I saved, I don't know, $10, but the economy is this exchange, right, of money. So ultimately it impacts the economy to have those frequent power outages. And like I said, climate change. We need to address climate change. We find that we don't really have any sort of plan in place. This is the first plan that acknowledges, climate change, and I'll show you some example of that. But we need to then, as a community, different agencies, different sectors, different agencies need to start thinking about climate change, because it's just going to make things more difficult. And as you can see from the list of bullets here, we already have a tall order in front of us. So you can read more of that in the plan. There's more detail in the plan. You can make comments, ask questions. You can reach out to us as you go through the plan if you have, you read something of interest. And at the end, we have recommendations. I will not go through them because we have hundreds of them. Just some highlights, which is to sort of, paying attention to infrastructure and strengthening, so the rebuilding that I mentioned earlier, but also pay attention to other type of aspect, the system thinking, the governance aspect, in order to become resilient. Without that, you just have a better building, and that's it. right? I was in the building recently where it was brand new, got built a few years ago. Water came out, the building was useless, right? Resilience was not thought about when the rebuilding happened for that building. So it's important to think about access to services in addition to stronger walls and a stronger roof. So we have, a series of recommendation, increasing engineering project management, so that's a human aspect. The AC to classroom, that's, the addressing the heat, work with other institutions. We also have a lot of recommendation about working with the nonprofit sector. We recognize that the nonprofit sector plays an important role. The government tends to only reach out to them when something goes wrong. But like I said, if you ignore your friend when things are well, if you reach out when something is wrong, you're not going to get the same quality of service, right? So maintaining those relationships is critical. Churches, thank you again for your hospitality tonight, but churches are important. And so maintaining and creating network among churches and government and communities can go a very long way in order to increase our capacity, increase our morale, and ultimately increase our resilience. So we have a lot of recommendations. We organize them into everything related to strengthening hazard management, which is overall strengthening infrastructure. We also have a lot of recommendation about encouraging system thinking and coordination among different types of infrastructure systems. And then we have a lot of recommendation about governance, policy, procedures, how you conduct business. And again, what we are saying is we need the three of them in order to be able to rebound after a hurricane, after an earthquake. Because after the hurricane, really, there was food, there was shelter offered, but ultimately a lot of people left because you want to go home and you want to be able to call people, you want to be able to live your life as soon as possible. If that's not possible, you're going to leave, right? We need more than a strong wall and food to survive. So that was for me the lesson of the hurricane, and that's what, as a team, we sort of try to convey this as a mitigation plan, and encourage you all to read as much as we can. Chapter 1 is an interesting chapter. That's where we sort of, introduce our, thinking process. We also provide a summary of the main finding. So you can read this one if you want to understand our approach and why it's important. Chapter 2 is the planning process. So events like this one, we had a lot of them, where we, heard feedback, heard input from the community to be sensitive to how to present stuff, but also what to include. Chapter 3 talks about the capability assessment and a lot of things that talk to you about governance structure and how the agencies work, how many project management they have, experience they have, etc., etc. Chapter 4 is the one where we talk about a lot of things that, usually people are interested in. Hazard, how earthquake is going to impact water, how earthquake is going to impact Department of Health, our ability to get, food, etc., etc. So that's in chapter 4. The chapter 5 goes in depth about the hazard, describes the wind, the storm surge, the earthquake, etc. So all the data that we use to talk about, the lifeline is in chapter 5. Chapter 6 is discuss what I told you about development and how we need to rethink development pattern if we want to reduce risk. Otherwise, we're going to have more costs because we spread out our assets, but we have fewer resources to deal with them. And then the strategies are in chapter 7. So, a lot of this is in chapter 7. And then chapter 8 is really talking about sort of the administration of the plan. So that's mostly for TIMA and FEMA to sort of know, okay, how we're going to update the plan, who's going to manage the plan, how are we going to make sure we're on track, etc., etc. So I encourage you to, read whichever chapter you are interested in. You can read all of it. It can be found at resilientbi.org/the plan. This is here a QR code, so you can I'm gonna pretend you take pictures of me, while you are actually looking at the QR code, no? So please do that, and then if you have any questions, you can email us, usbihmrp@gmail.com. And we can answer some questions. Somebody actually sent us an email saying the comment section was difficult to access, so we actually revamped the comment section. So if you have any comments, questions, send it to us. Otherwise, this QR code or this website, resilientvi.org/the plan, and provide your comments. Thank you.
Questions, reactions, thoughts?
Good morning, young man. Good afternoon. All right.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Michael Emmanuel. I know some of you, because I worked with you in the past with one, the HMRP team. So, policy and process is where I live. That's most of what I focus on. And I know that, well, actually, I want to ask is where do you think the territory is on different government side? As far as, being able to implement, the plan, the recommendations, as far as, especially from like, let's say, a policy procedure and capacity implementation standpoint. Because based on my experience, policy and procedural planning in the territorial government is not a strong point. And I'm just curious, based on what you've studied since I've been there. If you find anything different or anything else that you want to expound on for territorial capacity.
Thank you. And sir, do you want to take a sir? Because the vice representative, can you introduce yourself?
So, good evening, I'm the Martin, I'm the deputy mitigation officer for the Vitina, division, so I am the hazard mitigation side. So, Michael is actually part of that team, so
to do the work to, those practices, it's just like we have vacancies in every government agency across the territory. That slows our ability to recover. That slows our ability to implement. And the governor is well aware of it, so is the university, but we are all struggling to find people to come here or hire people with the skills that are here to do the work. And so it's a hard reality that if we were, all of our government agencies were full and the university was pumping out students that would enter the workforce, that would make a difference. But we are struggling with a loss of population, and that capacity is what we need to make ourselves more resilient. So it's a bit of a backdrop, but it's part of the reality. Many of you know, I mean, no matter what agency you go to, you're often underserved because the person candidate has been doing the job for 2 or 3 other people that aren't there. And so it's a constant challenge, so we have to keep that in mind, we have to be patient, but we have to work together. That's where that governance piece comes in, that you need all 3 of those goals to be working at the same time in order for us to reach some of the objectives and implement some of the recommendations.
And I think a very good point to make also is that in the work environment, we've noticed that since COVID has occurred, the general population of people do not want to work, or the mentality of how they used to want to work is not the same. That is a huge issue for us. I'm in hazard mitigation. We have a constant rotation of people that come in. I'll give an example. I have a 36-year operator of hotels. That's my background. So I ran hotels for 36 years until there were no hotels to run. So now I'm with the government now for 6 years, and it is extremely difficult for you trying to get people or to motivate people to want to work. So it's just some of the harsh realities that we go through in a work environment. This is a very real situation as it looks.
Any other question before Michael Scott? Michael. Oh, yeah.
I can, everybody hear me?
We have people on Zoom.
Thank you. Good night, my name is Leah Robinson. I just have a question specifically related to one of the threats, the emerging threats that you listed, the sarcasm levels. I was reading an article most recently by Island Innovation. And they were talking about how in Barbados, they're working now with farmers to try and change the sarcasm into kind of a tool for fertilizer for farmers, which would of course then kind of help to negate in some ways the negative impact that sarcasm has currently on economic impact activity. So want to recognize that I've had some discussions yet with the farmers about that. Yeah.
No, thank you for that question. Sargassum, as we identified, is an emerging challenge to the territory, actually throughout the Caribbean, Gulf of Mexico, and Central America. One of the problems is that farmers can use a little bit. You still have to rinse the salt out, you have to process it, but you can't use too much. There are heavy metals and other toxins in too much sargassum, and so we get far more than we need. If we were to just use, say, 5–10%, I'm making up a number, but the fact is, we could probably only use a small percentage of the sargassum and have the workforce to process it and then distribute it, getting back to the system question, how things work together. You just can't pile it on the beach and let it decompose. We have to move it somewhere. And so every solution has a number of extra steps that we have to think about. The problem with sargassum is that we can't touch it while it's offshore because it is critical fish habitat and it's protected by the EPA. They, don't allow you to divert it or to scoop it up off the water because it's the juvenile fish and a lot of other marine animals live in the sargassum until it hits the beach, where it obviously costs a lot more money and it's a lot more hassle. So it's a unfortunate example of too much with too few options to manage it. But I think in some places we can do something with it, but we know that it costs something like $20,000–$30,000 a day to remove it from our local beaches according to DPNR. We had a resort on the, east end of the island, they spent $500,000 just to take the sargassum off their property, off their beach, the coastline. That's not sustainable. And so we're going to have to get very creative. We have researchers at the university that are looking at both the currents that move sargassum here. We're also looking at the input. So the climate change in the warmer water actually speeds up metabolism of sargassum. And so it grows faster, but it's the land-based nutrients, both from South America and our local islands here in the Lesser Antilles, the Eastern Caribbean. The pollution fertilizes the sargassum, so it grows yet more. And so there's all these variables, some are local and some are global or international. But the fact is, it's going to be a problem that's here to stay until, we have a major shift. But there are small localized solutions that we should think about. Yes, sir.
Good evening, my name is Leonard K. Work with the church case manager. My concern is how do you bring the stakeholders to the table? Because the management aspect to me is important, especially when you talk about the water aspect and there are lots of water from where I stand. The kinds of use of water I've seen has increased and we're having more problems with water. So how do we bring, even with this in that area, the stakeholders to the table so that all of what you presented to us, which I think is impressive, and I've been sharing it to some friends across the region, what's happening, what will you just produce? So how do we bring them to the table? I don't.
Well, certainly, forums like this are absolutely essential. Raising awareness in the community is one of the most important parts. I mean, all the science in the world, if it's not communicated effectively, is wasted or lost. From there, though, you have to reach out to your representatives, whether the legislators or the governor, your church leaders, your community leaders, and help them understand the importance of working together on something as basic as water security. And so when you think about, if you have neighbors whose pipes are leaking badly and they have low water pressure, or whatever, or someone's got a cracked cistern, raise awareness, call Lava. You're gonna have to spend time, because you know that the phones aren't answered right away, or people put you on hold. So it's gonna take a lot of collective work and patience to get people to understand that this is not just your problem or your neighbor's problem, it's a territory-wide problem. And so we have to think and organize, and this gets into that cultural and diversity issue I mentioned early on. We have a very diverse community with lots of people from different places who speak different languages, whether it's Creole or Spanish, as well as, different dialects of English. We have to break down those barriers and say, we all share this issue. We have to create an identity as Virgin Islands. And so that's going to take work, and that happens through our culture, that happens through our music, it happens through our faith-based practices, but it also happens in your neighborhood. So for us to really be resilient, we have to start thinking and behaving and working collectively. That's a big reach in a place that has a lot of turnover and people coming from different places and people leaving, like we've been seeing. But the fact is, I don't see how we get around that without bringing our communities together and then holding our decision makers responsible. Show up and vote. There's plenty of other things we can do.
So, in addition to,
We have a question online.
yeah,
Okay.
in addition to what Kim said, I would say that hopefully you have now more information to when you reach out to, the elected official or a stakeholder or somebody at one of the agencies. Hopefully you have more information to insist on getting the service that you need. Because ultimately, that's the key, is getting the services that we need. And hopefully, part of us putting the plan together is to come up with recommendation, but it's also to kind of explain how we are doing so that we can go and say, hey, we're not doing well, look at all those, how can you fix it? I think it can potentially, or our hope is that it can lead to fruitful conversation, because now you have data, you have information, you have knowledge to hold whoever needs to be held accountable. So, that's also what we're trying to do with the plans, provide information, so that we can, make your case.
All right, we have, a question from our Zoom audience from Mr. Jason Budson. He's asking, will the different BI government departments and agencies give updates on their performance in meeting the goals and objectives of this plan? And what holds them accountable in keeping up to date and meeting their objectives? Thank you.
So, very good question, Jason. I think that, you going through the plan, going through the recommendation and asking at the next VITIMA meeting where we are is, you doing your work as a citizen, and holding, an agency accountable. I am sure that VITIMA will do its best to meet a lot of the requirement, but I'm just saying that, use the plan, and ask questions about the plan. Like I said, in the last section of the plan, the sort of boring section about plan maintenance and stuff like that. That's where we talk about the various mechanisms, that, VITIMA would be using to track progress. I'm looking at a computer as if I'm looking at you, Jason. To track progress. So, please use that portion and, just ask them. I cannot speak to it. Our task was to just put the plan together, with the input from the agencies. But now, the plan is public, so it's your turn.
But there is things that you can do as citizens. The fact is, for example, there is a comprehensive land and water use plan that's being developed by DPNR. And so there is an opportunity for you to talk to the folks at DPNR about your issues and how land is being used, because the more development we have and the more roads, the more rain comes down into town. The flooding, Greg showed you. So there are things you can do that can improve the situation. Coastal zone management, all these different agencies have public meetings, public hearings, and opportunities for you to find your voice and express yourself and help the decision makers know how important it is for them, and they can better prioritize next steps. But without your input, they're gonna make plans, do the things that they think is important, and that may not be in the public's best interest. I'm not throwing them under the bus, but the fact is, they need to hear from the citizens about the different plans, and they are required by law to have public hearings. Some of them are small, some of them are, minor, whether it's education, whether it's healthcare, but it takes all of us to show up and be heard.
Just a couple of things, I think I remember all. So, first and foremost, you really have to educate yourself. This is such a comprehensive plan. And the University of Virginia has done a tremendous job of actually meeting some of these stakeholders, having conversations, talking about the problems that they have. So this is one of the big steps that occur. So that's number one. Number two, the plan is very comprehensive. It's something that we have never seen before. Look at the plan, look at the action steps that we see. Look at the items that we recognize that are problems with those items. Take a look. If you see something that was missed, like Pastor KP made some comments about flooding. If you do not see things that were addressed in the plan, make comments, address it. Okay? We also have the Office of Disaster Recovery, USDI.com. Every single program that's occurring with federal dollars is in that system. If you want to see where a project is, if you want to see where the money is being spent, it's a really fantastic tool. It's open to the public. We update it on a weekly, sometimes, bi-weekly basis. it shows you where the federal dollars are actually going and how are they going to help us in the future. So really, it's really about educating yourself and actually wanting to be engaged. So I guess, having two Cat 5 storms really have opened up, the citizens. I'm a fifth generation birth island, I'm a Gumps. So, when people hear me, I say, I'm a Gumps. And I'm very passionate about what we do and what we're here to do and making sure that we work together to, Dr. Winnell's point. These bigger forums and meetings, they are going to happen, but these are things that are gonna happen as the plan is presented and the government comes with its body and starts to talk. But you, the public, are the loudest voices that we have. So if you have something that you're concerned about, voice your opinion. Between the senators, the governor's office, comments that are on, that you make on the website. The governor will see all of these suggestions or changes that you're talking about today. So this is your time and your opportunity to say what you have to say, and also go online and actually make your voice be heard. And the plan will come together, and then just know that this plan is so important to every one of us. That if this plan is not in place, we collect nothing in federal dollars. So this is extremely important that we actually work together, get this done, get it implemented in the government, and then move forward with these things, actually moving and taking place.
Any other questions? Yeah.
So thank you, by the way, for following up on my previous point. What I want to stress, and I'm gonna put my comments on my blog, but what I want to stress in this forum for people that are here is that, in my brief time working in the revenue, there's three things as far as recovery is concerned and resilience is concerned that I think are important, and it's important for regular operations too. Is people, policy, and process. I know for a fact that, just having worked in here and also on the plan as well, that these are areas where we are. And in order for the plan to work, we gotta make sure we gotta have competent people that know how to, not only write laws, policies, and procedures that are going to make this a reality, but also be able to understand it and actually implement it. Be able to understand how these different funding sources work, be able to understand how, how we can implement a process to actually go from getting, writing a grant to actually building something properly, or just taking our local dollars and building things properly. And being able to manage these things and being able to, to put it all together. And I know that these are three areas where the territory struggles. And, as somebody who's born and raised here, know my numbers. I was born and raised here. What I don't want to see is, I'm not, this is not anything, but I don't want to see platitudes thrown at people. Where you have this wonderful blend that is, as you said, 400 pages long, which, I read a lot of it. And it just kind of ends up on somebody's desk or on somebody's shelf, just as all the ones before it has. So, just, and like I said, I'm gonna make this comment on the plan as well, but what I really want to stress is that qualified people, policies, procedures are needed to take a plan and turn it into action, into tangible action. We can have all the plans we want, but we don't have people to actually make the plan happen. We don't have policies to actually streamline how we implement the plan. We don't have a process that people can understand, even if it's turnover, for instance. And I leave today, somebody comes in tomorrow, they can pick it up and say, all right, this is what we need to do going forward. Because that happens a lot too. We have a lot of instances where somebody's been working here for 20 years, they got somebody else comes in, That knowledge is gone. Nobody knows what's going on at that point. So you gotta start all the way over again. So this is why I want to stress those three things for the implementation of the policy in the fall, because, I mean, of the plan in the fall, because I definitely don't want to see, like, some other time, I'm excited to this moment, but I don't want to see it loose. So that, just a comment, you know, you don't have to respond to it, you don't, like you said. It's a comment I'm gonna make, a suggestion I'm gonna make on the plan as well, I just want everybody here to hear what that's. Okay.
Thank you, Michael. Any other questions, comments? Words of compliments? Okay, well, thank you so much. Do you have a question?
I was really trying to be. Good afternoon, and this is going to be directed to our wonderful young people. And I'm gonna put the onus on you, because once upon a time, I was you, I came back home full of energy, attended every public meeting that was geared to developing our community, went to the land and water use plan meetings, helped work on the plans for land and water usage, worked on the Environmental Association of St. Thomas, we worked on plans for everything from the dump to creating new landfill. And 30 years later, we're again into plan and preparing the plan. What I didn't do, and a couple of the other young people that came home when I didn't do, we did what we thought was great then and participated, but we did not step up and help to force the movement of this plan. Because the plans will be created, they'll be bound, documented, and stored. If you guys do not take the initiative to start pushing that or pushing forward the elected officials, the administration, and those who have the opportunity and ability to do the thing that we know need to be done. Don't sit back and wait to see when they're going to call, when they're going to make movement. I still have copies of the land and water usage plan on a jump drive that has not moved. I have watched the logo deteriorate because 30 years ago, the plan was there to make sure that that waterway did not get disturbed. So I'm putting it on you. And I'll be here to support you while I'm still able. But you guys are gonna have to be the driving force to make sure that this plan and the ones that are gonna come to supplement it do not get shelved. Just one other comment. This is the first plan that's actually online. It's to have its own website, so it's a live, living website that you are able to actually go to. It's not something that's gonna be thrown on the shelf. You can cut, copy, share, do whatever you need to do. Any section that you see that you need to focus on and send it to your senators, your governor, talk about it. But, you know, to her point, this is up to you. You are the one, you know, who is going to push and propel this plan forward. A lot of work went into this plan and a lot of hard, I mean, Michael and I, we worked together with, you know, with the UBI crew. I think it was almost 3 years. So there's a lot of information that's there for you. Read it, educate yourself, and push forward. Because you know, Osborne and I, we are gonna be the ones that are going to have to assist that this actually moves forward. So it's up to us.
All right, well, again, if there's no other comments or questions, on behalf of UBI and by Chima, I want to thank you for taking the time to join us this evening. Again, you have the QR code. Please take a moment to skim the document, go to the chapter that Greg pointed out, to find areas that are of particular interest to you, whether it's your health, or education, or water, or any of the other topics in the plan. And then share it. Like I said, share the link with, as Linda just mentioned, but let's get the word out and see if we can do something different with this plan than we've seen with some of the previous plans on paper. So,
Yeah, sorry. And, we have up until June fifth to make comments. It's 30 days. The clock started ticking at the May 7th. I think it's when
June seventh is the end of the comment period. So we have until June seventh. I mean, the plan will still be up, but as far as the comment period, please take advantage of the next few weeks to do that. And one more.
One more question from our listening Zoom audience from Mr. Archie Jennings. Why not schedule a follow-up meeting for implementation?
again, thank you, Archie Dennis. So again, it's the same thing. This is gonna be presented to the governor. And if, once the policy comes into play and the governor signs this, that this is acceptable, he accepts the changes, the policy, we can start on that point. So I hope Archie's question.
So,
But that's really where it's gonna start.
another way is, please send us an email at usdi@hmrp@gmail.com. Has to be on our list, on our email list. We will be having more public meetings about different projects that derived from this project. So for example, on May 29th, is that 29th on St. Croix?
Yes.
On May 29th, we're gonna have a public meeting on St. Croix that will be on Zoom. So St. Tomian, you can, listen to it about the coastal environment and how it's eroding and how public access to the coast is now, a question mark. So, that has definitely some policy, implication. But we will have that discussion on May 29th. We're gonna have another discussion sometime in June, July, about some of the social vulnerability and the economy and what it means for the territory. So we are planning throughout the year a series of public meetings. Some of them will be on Zoom, some of them will be in person. We're gonna provide more information to you. That's our way of making this plan alive and making sure that we follow up on some of the issues that were identified. And like my colleague said, go to your legislative meeting, go to your senators, public forum, you have information, ask them the question. Thank you.